Hi, I'm Erin. Welcome to this high crafting embroidery tutorial. In this video, I'll show you how to stitch up the designs from my Hey Cute Shoes Stick and Stitch collection. And the colors I'll be using are from my Sunflowers Forever thread palette and my Smoky Mountains thread palette. And for most of these, I will be using a size 3 embroidery needle. I'll also include timestamps in the description so you can skip ahead to whichever design it is that you need to see a tutorial for. I'll be using 3 strands of embroidery floss for all of these designs except for the twinkling stars, which we'll use 2. I separate out all the strands individually and then I rejoin them together, tie a knot in the end, and then I thread the other end through my needle, the eye of my needle. For the leaf stitch, I start by bringing my needle up at the very top of the first leaf, and then I bring my needle down about 2/3 of the way down through the center of the needle. And then from there, I'll bring my needle up on each side. I'll start on one side and then push it through right below where I went down for my last stitch. And I also use my needle to help straighten out my strands of floss. Sometimes they can twist, and running your needle underneath your stitch can help those threads lay side by side, and that'll give you better coverage as well. So now I bring my needle up on the other side at the next point on the line where I need my stitch to begin. Sometimes it helps to use your fingers to hold down the stick and stitch pattern. It may come up loose, but if you just hold your finger down on the fabric, it'll stay in place. So I just alternate sides, coming up at the next point on the line and bringing my needle down right under the previous stitch. And you'll just continue doing that until you've reached the bottom of the leaf. Also, feel free to speed up or slow down the video to whatever works best for you. To tie off the stitch, I'll run my needle under a couple stitches and create a loop, and then feed my needle through that loop, creating a little knot. And you can do this more than once if you really need to secure your threads, if you're stitching on something that's going to be used, worn, or washed. And then you'll bury your tail under a few stitches and snip. It's good to get in the habit of tying off each section before moving on to the next section, so that if the fabric is thin or light, if light happens to get behind your fabric, you can easily see that there's threads running to and from different sections of the design. So I think it's a really good idea to be in the habit of tying off each section if you can, so that you won't risk seeing that thread being carried from section to section. And for the stem of the branch, I'm using the stem stitch. I know, revolutionary, right? But it does really create a quite nice stem, so it's the obvious choice. So for this rainbow, I'm going to use 3 different ways to fill each section. This first one is going to be a chain stitch, and I'd start that by bringing up my needle at one point and then pushing my needle back down through that same point, creating a loop. Then I'll bring my needle up at the next point where I want my next stitch to begin, and then I'll drape the loop over the needle, and again push my needle back down where it just came up from, creating another loop, and you'll just repeat this around. And you can do this for all of the sections, or you could use the other techniques that I'm going to use for all the sections, or however you want. So for this section, I'm going to fill it with a satin stitch. And the way I like to do satin stitches is I like to create smaller sections to work with, as opposed to just doing side-by-side stitches all the way around. So you'll see what I mean here in a moment, but I'm just using short stitches to fill in this area. For this next section, or the last section, I'm going to use French knots to fill it. And you'll bring your needle up through the back of the fabric, wrap it. For this, I wrapped it twice. And then you'll put your needle down right next to where you came up. Don't put it in the same hole because you'll pull your knot through that hole. You'll want to put your needle down right next to where it came up from. Okay, so bring your needle up through the fabric, wrap it, put your needle in right next side where you came up, snug that knot down to the surface of the fabric, and then pull your needle the rest of the way through. I do have a more in-depth video tutorial on my TikTok under my stitch tutorial playlist if you really want to see like a bird's eye view of that and get a more thorough explanation. I'll link that in the description. So for the moon, you can do a back stitch and outline it, but we're going to fill this moon in. And the way I do that is with kind of a feathered satin stitch. I want you to think croissant. This is what this is going to look like as we're stitching it. It's going to look a little bit like a croissant. I start by doing little straight stitches and I feather them slightly. So if you can see, it's almost like a little spirograph. That's probably not it. I guess feathering is what I mean. But as I stitch, I'm just going to get this tip filled in a little bit. And then once I get to a certain point, I'm just going to start doing what I did on the rainbow and create sections, smaller sections for me to work with. So I got that tip finished and now I'm creating the smaller sections to work with. And I'll do that till I get to about the same point on the other side where I finished the tip, and I'll create the tip on that end. So our little croissant moon is shaping up very nicely. You can see it looks like an actual croissant. But now that I've gotten both those tips finished, I can now complete these little sections that I've created. And I really think that this makes it more manageable. It seems like I get my spacing more even, and then this prevents my stitches from getting slanted or wonky. For these little four-pointed twinkling stars, you could do a little back stitch. You'd probably want to reduce your strands. Oh, by the way, I'm using 2 strands for this. It's such a small design. I thought 3 strands might be too bulky, but you can give 3 strands a try. That might not be a bad idea, but for the tutorial, I chose 2. But you could do an outline stitch, but I think these look much nicer filled in. So I do a little satin stitch, and it's just a straight stitch, and then I taper down the sides of each stitch, so I just get a little bit smaller and a little bit smaller, but these stitches are butted up right up against each other. For the sunflower, I like to use 2 different yellows so that I get the petal dimension, but also for petal dimension, I do a little technique that's similar to the leaf stitch, where I don't bring that first stitch all the way down. I just bring it most of the way down, and each stitch will be alternated one side then the other, and I'll bring those stitches down to the bottom of the previous stitch until I hit the center, and then I'll start working my stitches out horizontally to fill in the petal. I hope that makes sense. You'll see what I mean in a moment. But the reason I'm doing this is because I want to create that little crease look that is often on petals or sunflower petals. I really hope that makes sense. And if you're stitching up the half sunflower, you'll use these same techniques. You'll just be doing half as much. for the daisy petals, I do what's called a radial satin stitch. And this is used when you are stitching on something that's round and the outside of it is larger than the inside of it. So where we have room on the outside for all these stitches, the inside is smaller, and you'll get stitch crowding if you bring all of your stitches down to the same points, you know, the center, the bottom of the petal. So we need to make shorter stitches. Maybe every other stitch will be shorter. So you see here that that stitch was a little bit shorter than the first stitch I did. Oops. And I run my needle underneath it, which just helps kind of fill out the stitches. So I made that stitch shorter. Oops. And then I'll bring this stitch all the way down, and it will cover the bottom of that first stitch, that second stitch, so you won't even know that second stitch didn't go all the way down. And this is, and you, depending on the size of what you're stitching, you can bring your stitch all the way down every 3 stitches, every other stitch, every 4 stitches. It just depends on what you're stitching. Here, it's just kind of, I'm eyeballing it. But this is a technique you can play around with, and you'll see how it allows you to be able to bring your stitches to the center without them being crowded. So once you're done embroidering, you can take your piece and rinse it off with some warm water. You'll want to use your thumbs or fingers to maybe agitate the stitches gently and remove some of the stabilizer. You can also use a sprayer, but I would suggest using it on a gentle spray. Once you've rinsed off the stabilizer, do not wring it out. You'll want to lay it in a towel and then roll it in the towel to help wick away the extra moisture. And if it's on shoes, just set them off somewhere dark and dry to dry off. So thank you so much for watching this tutorial. Thank you so much for your order if you purchased the Hey Cute Shoe Stick and Stitch patterns. I hope you love them, and I would love to see your work, so please tag me in any photos you share online. You could tag me at #HighCrafting, or you can share them with me in my inboxes. I'd love to see them. Thanks again.